In this episode, we will explore the core principles of effective leadership and how self-awareness can influence our methods. We are joined by financial executive and thought leader, Matthew Orrico, CPA, FPAC, CPCU, who will share his experiences and insights on the journey to authentic leadership.
Welcome to the Omega Podcast with Matt Orrico. Matt is a value-based, people-centric leader who enjoys leadership roles across professional, nonprofits, and faith-based ministry organizations. Matt's professional background is in accounting and finance, particularly within financial services, with a focus on delivering excellence through innovation and developing strong teams. Despite his achievements, Matt is most proud of his young family who provide him with the leadership opportunity, which is, in his view, the most important and rewarding. Matt, it is such a pleasure to have you on the Omega Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Keenan. It's great to see you.
Yeah, it is great to be seen. I am so excited about our conversations on values, being a value-based leader. And I hope throughout our conversation that the executives or leaders listening to our conversation can be able to get some wisdom and nuggets to be able to apply to their teams or organizations. But before we get into all of the fun topics and discussions that we will partake in, can you share a little bit more about yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, Keenan, I can definitely do that. And again, pleasure to be here. And I hope they get those nuggets they're looking for. But yeah, no, I mean, as you said, professionally, I am in accounting and finance. I did a few years in public accounting, and I spent the majority of my career at Amica Mutual Insurance Company in Rhode Island. Wonderful company, which we'll talk about is, finding organizations or building them that have the same values you do, right? So very people-centric type work, and a wonderful organization there. I am, as you said, I also spent some time, on some wonderful nonprofit boards. I enjoy, volunteering and things like that in other respects. And actually, the way we met was through, faith-based ministry. I have a Christian ministry for men called Force Ministries with my friend Josh, and that's actually how we originally met, Keenan. And all that keeps me busy, along with I have a young family here with my wife, and that's great. That's fun too. So glad to be here, and glad to talk about leadership across all those different areas.
That's beautiful. And I appreciate you mentioning how we met in regards to a faith-based ministry organization, because it just shares that it doesn't really matter where you are. You can meet great people that have similar values and are on the same life journey, that truly want to be the best leaders that they possibly can be. And for us, it's through our faith in Christ. So I'm excited about our conversation. But for many of our listeners, they might hear the term values, and that has multifaceted definitions, but could you elaborate on what it truly means to lead from your values in a practical sense and how that manifests in your day-to-day leadership decisions?
Yeah, Keenan, good question. Take a step back for a minute. It's funny because, a lot of folks realize, particularly leaders, as you talk about values and mission and purpose, they understand that organizationally, these things are really important. Right. So if you have an organization and it doesn't know its mission, then it really is going to have a hard time casting a vision of where it's trying to go. And of course, if it doesn't have values and culture, then it doesn't know how to operate. And so, a lot of folks recognize the fact that if that's the case, that organization isn't going to be great, most likely. Right. It might exist. It might kind of be mediocre, but it's probably not going to be great because it's not intentionally going towards something. Right. It's just going to maybe wander a bit. Most of those organizations really don't have a good identity, don't last that long. Right. But then as it applies back to themselves as leaders, folks don't always make the same connection. Right. So those same things that are really important organizationally, having a mission and understanding your purpose and having vision and understanding your values and how you operate, those same things are important to us, of course, as people and definitely as leaders. So, what's leading from your values? Really, if you're going to bottle that up, it really is about understanding who you are as a person, right? What your purpose is and what your values are, so that you can use those as a foundation to effectively lead others, right? That's really what it is, right? So asking the big questions of yourself, right, as we develop as people over time, what are those big questions of who am I and what's important to me? And then letting those be the foundation for how you make your decisions. So there's a lot there, glad to dive into those things. But as you talk about value-based leadership, what is that? It's really about understanding who you are and what drives you, and letting that inform how you make your decisions and the lens that you see the world through.
Absolutely. And I think having that personal assessment, being able to see what makes me passionate, what gets me up in the morning. I think those are such great starting points for individuals that are just coming into an organization, because to be frank, in these larger corporations, they have their set of values. But it's so important that you have to do that self-digging, that self-assessment to be able to reflect on your values and how that align to the company that you're working for. Or maybe if you're looking to develop your own organization, how do you instill those values in the day-to-day operations? And, in your bio, you're a father who are growing up in this world, and those values matriculate in the day-to-day. And I think it's so important for individuals to start having those internal conversations to narrow that down, right? To know who you are, instead of having what people may say is imposter syndrome. But how do you believe an individual's personal values are typically formed? Does it start from birth? And at what point do they become a foundational element of their leadership identity?
Yeah, what a question, Keenan. How are our values, and our purpose developed? It's all a process, right? For anybody, it's a process of developing over time, right? But ultimately, that happens in a lot of ways. Certainly your values and things start being set in your childhood and develop over time, but those aren't always necessarily the things that you ultimately grow up and value the most as you go, right? And so how can it happen? It can happen in a number of different ways. For me personally, a lot of my growth in this way came as I started to ask these big existential questions in my own life and metaphysical questions in my own life. And ultimately that drove me to, a heavy faith-based system, which is how I see the world and how it informs, what I do. Right. So that was a story for me. It may not be the same story for everybody. It doesn't need to be the same story for everybody. Right. But really what's important here is intentionality. Right. That's what I would say. So how does it develop? It has to develop intentionally. One of the things that I think is true is that if you don't intentionally answer some of these questions for yourself, the world's going to kind of tell you what those answers are, right? So I think as we are maturing, it's intentionally stepping up and trying to figure out, what is important to me. And the way you can do that, again, a number of different ways. Certainly mentors and the people you surround yourself with are big in this way, but also, what are you consuming? What are you reading? What are you watching? As leaders, leadership books and business books are great, but it's not just that, right? If we're talking about developing purpose and value, that means we need to be reading and consuming things in a broader spectrum. Are you spending time in philosophy and theology and history and all these, sociology, all these different areas, so you can start to develop, your view of the world and yourself and how you see others and ultimately, how you can lead in this place. So it's a big question, Keenan. There's a number of different ways to get there. But I think the big thing I'd say is it's intentionality. It's trying to figure these things out intentionally over time.
Absolutely. I love that response, because intentionality is so crucial. Because if you're not thinking about the future, if you're not taking those necessary steps to develop your personal values now, then as you said, the world, the environment that you're part of is going to start to mold they're going to mold their values and basically instill that. And you really aren't going to have much of a say, because you're just going to kind of go by kind of the rules or that environment that you placed yourself in. But one thing I really appreciate from that response was what you're consuming. Is it the types of content that you're consuming, the books, the resources that you're putting around you that's going to really help you develop those concrete values that's going to help with your leadership approaches. And, that's a foundational element. when it comes to your leadership identity is how exactly you are consuming in your private time is what's going to be regurgitated out, right? So it's kind of this analogy of if you consume bad food, what's going to come out. You're going to feel overweight. You're going to feel tiresome. The output isn't going to be equivalent to the input, if that makes sense. And I think that that's so crucial for leaders to be very mindful about. But can you share a specific instance, throughout your journey, whether it's part of the force ministry or your leadership at Amica or just in any particular capacity, where your strong set of values directly guided you through a challenging leadership situation? And what was the particular outcome? Because leaders across the board, regardless of vertical or industry that they're part of, has encountered challenges where they've had to draw the line in the sand and say, these are my values and I'm going to stick to them regardless of, whose toes you might be stepping over or on.
Yeah, Keenan, to be honest with you, I may answer that question a little bit of a different way, and only because if I'm doing it right and truly leading from my values and leading from, intentionally from purpose, hopefully the majority, theoretically, hopefully everything I'm doing is coming from that place. Now, in reality, that isn't always the case. We don't do this 100% of the time, even if we're intending to. So instead, I think what I would say is I talk about what happens when I don't lead from my values. So for me personally, my core values, I have a very people-centric view. Just based on worldview and a lot of things, I have a very people-centric view of leadership. But then my values underneath that personally, right? It's integrity and honesty and courage and humility. And a lot of those, they stick no matter what. But I'll tell you, when I get in real high pressure situations, if I'm not careful, the humility aspect falls off, right? And I don't necessarily mean you start thinking egotistically about yourself intentionally. What I mean is I stop asking for others' opinions. I start just doing things myself and kind of bull rush ideas. I get more task oriented than people oriented and all these things. And again, there's times you get things done and all of that's understood. But, when I really kind of don't stay disciplined in this myself, that's when I start to fall into more of a self-focused view as opposed to, one that's driven for others. Right. So, for me, that would be, more the answer is being careful or being cognizant of what happens when you don't. It becomes very apparent over time when you don't, if you're trying to do it consistently, well.
Yeah. And I think the one issue that leaders face when they don't lead from their values is they have something that we would probably call imposter syndrome, is when they don't know who they are. Yeah. So when they enter a room, they assimilate to the environment and there's no identity. And then they wonder, and the question that they ask themselves is, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I upset? Or why am I bitter about the circumstances that are against me? Why do I feel the way I feel? And I think it just leads back to that main question is, if you're not reflective of your personal values, then you will never be able to lead from them. And then, as you already shared, and as we already emphasized, you're just going to allow the environment to dictate the direction of your leadership.
I think that's true, Keenan. If I could, adaptability is important. Right? We all have to be able to adapt. But I think what's interesting about this is you're actually more adaptable if you're more secure in who you are and what's driving you. Right? You're actually more free to adapt to the situation because you're not changing the foundational principles that drive you or that you live off of. So you're able to express yourself differently depending upon what the situation is, right? Mm-hmm. If you're not sure, as you're saying, these things aren't established, you do have a lot of fear or anxiety or at least uncertainty on what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. You're not quite sure. So what we're not saying here is, hey, don't be adaptable. That's not it. You absolutely need to be adaptable and need to be hearing others. But it's being firm in what's absolutely most important, and that frees you up, right, to be adaptable and to work well with others, regardless of their worldview or their values, right? You're able to work with anybody, right, because you're very secure in where you're coming from.
Right. And I think people can begin to feel when you're not leading from that strong point, right? Because that matriculates into the team dynamics, right? If you're a leader, let's say you don't know yourself, you're not reflective of your values, and you're just kind of doing things, people begin to feel, as you mentioned, doubtful. They start to fear they start to be in fear because they're unsure as to what the particular outcome is based upon your leadership approaches. But, being in a leadership role, as you mentioned, there's a lot of high stress environments. There's situations where you are uncertain as to what the outcome is going to be, whether you might have to lay people off, whether a particular crisis is going to interrupt the flow of your business. There's so many different factors here. But in your experience, what are the most significant differences between a leader operating from a clear sense of purpose, rooted in values, versus one driven by fear?
Yeah, sure. And I think it manifests over time pretty clearly, right? So someone who's leading from their values, typically knows where they're trying to go, right? In some way, shape, or form. There's in values and being purpose driven, right? They can, just like an organization, right, that has a clear mission, right, can cast a clear vision. A person who has clear values and has a good idea of who they are, even though they're always developing and refining over time, they can cast a nice vision of where they're going. They're very intentional about going in a certain direction. Ultimately, if you're leading from fear, you're more leading to avoid things than you are leading towards things, right? So you're leading away as opposed to leading towards. And so, from that, and again, there's a lot of different ways that this can come about, right? But, some of the things that you start to have, anxiety, certainly, decisions can become very difficult, right? Because each one you're taking complete, you don't have a prism that you're looking at things towards, right? So decisions can be very difficult. You can be very, risk adverse. And again, this isn't about the level of risk you're willing to take on, but taking on any risk, personal or organizational, can be difficult. And certainly even, relationship building and transparency and authenticity with the folks that you work with can be very difficult. So, there's a big difference, and I think everyone can sense it. And again, I'll go back to organizational. There's a big difference between, knowing where you're going and going there very intentionally versus just reacting. It's the same thing with people, right? You know when somebody is going intentionally towards something as opposed to just trying to avoid tough outcomes, right? So, I think that's where you see it, Keenan. And I think that can come through in level of control and things like that too, as you try to control situations.
We are eager to present this episode and look forward to your feedback on the impact of purpose-driven leadership.
Yeah. No, that's very fascinating that you mentioned the importance of being purpose-driven, because you have to cast a vision, right? The vision for your team, the vision for your life, the vision for your business or organization. I mean, if you're not having a clear vision, then the people will perish, as in there's no alignment. People don't have a specific process, or I would like to call it, I think of like the footprints in the sand. There's no steps in place for them to walk into, right? They're just kind of going in any direction that they want to. And, you're just hitting it right there regarding decision fatigue, being risk averse, and part of your experience is being innovative. And if you're a leader in this time that we're in with all of these different changes and economic uncertainty and tariffs, I mean, with all of the change requires innovation. And if you're risk averse, you're not being innovative, which means you're going to be behind from your competitors. You're not going to have the fortitude to think outside of the box, to perhaps take that risk, perhaps to invest into artificial intelligence, perhaps to wind down, right, when it comes to cost saving and cost reduction, right? Because you're not thinking the long game, right? You're not thinking about the long game. So, how does a leader's understanding of their own self and worldview directly influence their ability to lead effectively and authentically? And that's kind of a two-edged sword, because we're talking about being an effective leader, but then you're also being authentic to yourself. And that's something that people don't like to mix two and two together.
Yeah, no, and understandably so. And I think one of the things, just before I answer that, to touch on is, when people hear a conversation like this, sometimes they think, well, does that mean that you're, making everyone around you have to have exactly the same values or exactly the same worldview? And that's actually not what we're saying at all, right? And, we need to be able to work with people with all different types of worldviews and different types of values. But it is important that, and by the way, and then we learn from each other through that, and we innovate with each other through that. Those are all good things. That's not what we're saying. But it is important for a leader, right? First, to be in an organization or creating an organization that is aligned, again, like we said earlier, with their values at a high level, right? You have to be in an organization that values what you value to some degree, or over time, there's going to be so much tension where it doesn't work, right? You have to be in that type of a place. And then, culturally, you are going to set up a certain culture that aligns with the values of the organization, aligns with the values that you have, and you're going to value the same types of things, right? And I think that's going to attract a certain type of person over, right? So, I'll use an example, right? So again, integrity, honesty, like these are things that are very high value to me, right? And what I found is that over time, I run, the different things, and I'm not just talking about vocationally, but in other areas as well, these are things that are really, very important to me, and they attract a certain type of people that value those same things, right? So it's important, I guess, to know what those are, be transparent, right, as a leader on what those things are, not necessarily pushing them, just to a level that's reasonable and responsible, letting people know what's important to you. By the way, asking them what's important to them, communicate, right? So you know how to work with each other, you know what's important. And then that allows you to lead from authenticity, allows you to, again, foster communication, foster trust. These are all things that push an organization forward.
Absolutely. And those homogenous environments can be very dangerous when you have everyone part of the culture that think the same way, act the same way, like the same things. It may work in some contexts, but I think when we talk about innovation, when we talk about trying to be cutting edge, I think having different thought processes and different types of skill sets and people from different walks of life that have different age groups and different backgrounds, I think that all culminates into this, I call it this nice, beautiful pot that allows us to be able to really tackle some very critical matters that will help our society as a whole. But one
100%.
thing that you mentioned was that conversation. And that's very difficult to have, because you can, there could be a CEO listening to our conversation now, or an executive that says, hey, there's over 1,000, 3,000 plus employees at my company, throw out a number. There's no possible way for me to sit down with all 3,000 plus individuals. There's no way. But I think if you are able to narrow down on those first 5, maybe 10 individuals that you can just sit down and have coffee with, or maybe just have 10, 15 minutes out of your day and just ask them, what's their perspective on X matter within your organization? Get their perspective, develop a dialogue. I think it will give the leader receiving this information a clear perspective of their corporate environment, so then they can be able to address other issues in a way that one will help them be authentic to themselves, because it's a one-on-one conversation. They can be able to hear your perspective and you can also hear theirs. I think it's a little bit more difficult when you're in corporate functions, or if you're going to a conference when you're in front of thousands of people, right? It's just kind of very one-sided, very lecture oriented. You're presenting in that regard. So the authenticity aspect could be lost, right? Because people aren't getting that particular feel from you. But I think when you are able to have those one-on-one approaches, just kind of adding to your response, that really helps. And I think that will kind of help regarding that direct influence to be able to lead effectively, because people will begin to know you, right? And what you stand for.
And again, Keenan, like you said, and you want to get to know them, right?
Yes.
You want to get to know them. It's not just about, you having your values. Everyone has their own, right? And you're looking for alignment. And that's where relationship grows and trust grows. And that's where, again, real progress comes from. In that way, Keenan, a little bit of a stray off of this, but I think it's really important in this. You come from, who, you start to develop who you are, your purpose and your values, and you try to be transparent, again, to a reasonable degree, right? You're not trying to offend everybody or push your value. That's not what we're talking about, right? But then also accountability is important. So one of the things that I found really, for myself, is, putting some people around me who do know at a pretty deep level who I am and what I'm trying to do, right? And this isn't everybody, right? This is a very select group of people in my life, a very diverse set of backgrounds, and even the way I know them, that sit down and they know what I'm doing, and I've given them license to speak into my life if they see me going off course in this way. Right? They say, no, you're not doing something according to the way that you set out to do it, or this seems not to be you. Can you care to explain this? So, one thing I say to any leader, right, is to hold yourself accountable by putting some folks around you that can speak into your life and into what you're doing without fear or anything like that, right? Just as a helpful hand to make sure you stay on track.
That's a great perspective to have, because I think many leaders will start entering into an executive role or into a leadership role and feel as though I have to do this myself. There's no one that's really in it for me. I got to protect myself from everyone else. And I understand that type of mentality. However, what you just mentioned, Matthew, I think is the key to unlock so much more progression, growth professionally, but also just in all of your relationships, is having friends and relationships that can speak into your circumstance. In other words, it's having other advisors, right? Having other counsel that you can be able to share. This is the particular situation that I'm in. How would you approach it? What would be your approach to it? Now, this can be unbiased. This can kind of be, something that you can do pro bono. I mean, it doesn't really have to be, you have to hire a consultant, even though some do. Right. But I think it's super important to look at yourself and really, as you said, hold yourself accountable. Right. Because people are depending on us. Right. People are depending on you. And if you're not doing what you need to do, right, that trust, transparency, then you start to lose that trust. And then before you know it, you're not leading anyone because you really can't lead yourself. And that's a deeper question. Right. And that's a very deep question to get into. But if you could think back, Matt, to when you were starting this professional journey, you're an extremely accomplished individual. And for those that may or may not know Matt, I mean, Matt has a CPA. I mean, I can go down the list of just all of the incredible certifications that you have. And for those emerging leaders, what advice would you offer on beginning the journey of self-discovery to better understand, their own values and worldview?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think some of the things we already touched upon, right? I mean, it's intentionality and really surrounding yourself with, if you can find good, a good mentor and some other people around that can guide you, but again, are you trying to figure these things out and realizing it takes time and all of that? But if you're a young leader coming up, I mean, first of all, what I would say is, a lot of folks think that, being successful in general and, being a great leader is, being the most talented person or being the smartest one in the room. And, I think those things are great, but honestly, that's not it, right? Most of it at the foundational level, right, is about natural curiosity, right? Continuous learning, right? Having a good work ethic, for most of us, it's not handed, right? You need to continue to show up, each day. And I don't just mean showing up, although that's a good start. Right. But actually show up and put in the effort, and then, working on interpersonal relationships. But as you build on that and you get into leadership and you think about, okay, now I need to be able to communicate effectively and know where I'm going confidently and all these things. Yeah. I mean, you have to broaden this out from just your own disciplines that you're comfortable in and start to think broadly about, the world and who you are. So, again, reading books, talking to people who have done this for a while, getting a coach, perhaps, if that's the way you want to go. These are huge things, right? Start going down that journey into areas that maybe make you uncomfortable, you've never gone down before. You'll be amazed. You say, well, how is this going to possibly help me professionally? Again, you understand who you are better, you see the world better, then you can layer on, the leadership tactics and things to articulate that. So long-winded way of saying, Keenan, it really does come down into intentionality on who you surround yourself with, what you're consuming, and then staying with it over time, right? Discipline.
Right. And you said something that many people don't like to hear, Matt, and that is being uncomfortable. And the process, that is the key. Being uncomfortable within itself is something that many people just can't get over that hurdle. Is just sitting there and recognizing I have to do the work. I have to be disciplined in this process in order to get the outcome that I desire. But until you're able to sit with that discomfort, there's no progress that's going to be made, because you're always going to hit that wall and you're going to stop, even though you can get past it. You can exceed it if you desire to do that. I mean, can you speak more to that, sitting in that discomfort, recognizing that there's still more for me to go, even though I'm uncomfortable? Because that's a very difficult place to be.
It is, but like you just said, I mean, uncomfortability is where the growth comes, right? So it's like, you look back, it's like you think about like a working out analogy, right? I mean, if you go to the gym every day and it never hurts and you never break a sweat, right? You're probably not really accomplishing that much, right? And it's the same way, right? The growth comes when it gets difficult, right? That's how you get to be, lift more weight or run faster, whatever it is, or you got to continually push yourself. It's not any different than anything else, right? Being uncomfortable is where the growth comes. Yeah, it's risky. Yeah, it's scary, but it's where the growth comes. It's actually where the most fun is too, once you get used to it a little bit. What I would say is, as I reflect back, and I'm not that old of a guy, right? But my whole, particularly the last decade, has been one of continuous uncomfort and pushing through that because there's the vision of something bigger, right? So it's moving into uncharted waters and just understanding that, again, if you want to do special things, if you want to be an effective leader, if you want to be good at anything, you need to continue to push yourself, right? You have to. If you're comfortable all the time, if you're too comfortable, you're probably not growing, right? So get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It sounds easy, but really, there's a lot in that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that through the analogy of working out, if you're not breaking a sweat, are you really working out, right? And there are some telltale signs or behaviors that indicate a leader is operating in that comfort zone. And I hope people that are listening to our conversation are thinking, oh, I got to do something like super outrageous and make myself. We're not saying that. But what I'm saying is going back to our conversations with your team, like maybe asking some more deeper questions, maybe leaning into HR, maybe finding out what might be the matter regarding the people-centric approach. What might be the issue with other aspects of your business that might not be working. I was always told if you continue to lean into your strengths, eventually you plateau. They don't become a better strength. It is what it is. But when you look at the weaknesses and you work on your weaknesses, then that's when the true growth will start to ensue. And I think that that's something that more leaders should look into. But are there any telltale signs or maybe some indicators that you have experienced where it kind of clicked in your brain and said, hey, I'm too comfortable here. I need to sort of switch my brain. I need to get some help in another area in order to improve this particular skill or improve in these relationships or just kind of help in that process, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think back to the point you were just making, though, about strengths and weaknesses, one of the other things as a leader, as you do understand yourself better, right? Understand your strengths. Sometimes the best thing to do isn't necessarily, to figure out how to do something you're not as good at yourself. It's to bring people around you who are better at things than you are, right? Again, you don't necessarily want to be the smartest one in the room or the best one at everything, right? If you're a leader, in fact, I prefer to have a lot of people around me that are a lot better at a lot of things than I am, right? So yeah, absolutely. But, back to your question about telltale signs that you're too comfortable. Again, if you're lacking innovation and you're lacking you're not excited about anything and it's just kind of run of the mill. Again, it can be a sign that you're kind of on a repeat cycle, right? And again, security is good and these things are good. So like you said, Keaton, I'm glad you did. We're not saying, go crazy with this necessarily. But I think the thing to understand about all this is, this is a long-term thing. And what we're after here is, ultimately getting the most value and purpose, long-term. Right. And so if you're not, growing and it's just all tactical based and there's nothing bigger to look at and you don't see any movement, right, over time, it can be a sign that maybe you need to refine your direction a little bit, start to grow in a different area, again, try to foster some innovation. But this is not something that, as you'd expect, something with this kind of value. We're talking about some pretty big concepts here. It takes time, and it's kind of ugly, and that's okay, right? That's okay. But that's where the growth, again, that's where the growth comes in. So if you're lacking innovation and you're not excited over an extended period of time, it could be a sign of that.
Perfect. And I know we're getting close to the conclusion of our conversation, but are there any common misconceptions about value-based leadership? And if so, how would you clarify them?
Yeah, I think two, and we touched on one already. One is when you hear this, everyone thinks that means just imposing your values on everyone else, or that you're too static and you can't be flexible and you can't work with others. And that's just not the case, right? That's not the case at all. Again, it's understanding yourself and understanding other people better, right? So that you can actually achieve outcomes. I think the other one is, that we're talking about all soft stuff. It's like, yeah, but where's the delivery on this? Like, we have a job to do. And it's a yes, but understanding that if you take the time to do these things, the results will actually be better, right? Again, you're talking to someone who's in accounting and finance. It's a pretty objective world, and we're talking about these very kind of gray matters here. But in my view, again, it's you take the time and you do these things, and those outcomes will come, and they'll be more sustainable over time, and they'll be stickier, right? Because you have real relationships and things, and people are really following a leader they can get behind that's authentically, it's authentically a person that they know. The results will come, so it's not the fastest route necessarily. It's kind of a long journey, but it's for more sustained and even greater outcome. So those two things, Keenan. It's not about being static. You're always growing, right? It's not about imposing your views on everybody or not being able to work with everybody. That's absolutely not what we're talking about. And it is and you will get those that excellence, right? You will get those things, but you're going at it in maybe a foundational grounds up kind of approach.
That's great. And just looking ahead, how do you see the emphasis on personal values and self-development shaping the future of effective leadership in an increasingly complex world? I mean, we're talking about tariffs, we're talking about the age of AI, we're talking about robotics, we're talking about, economic uncertainty. I mean, how does this all be relevant in this day and age?
Yeah, I mean, it's relevant in any day and age, right? I mean, these are things where, you understand the bigger picture and you're anchored, right? Then no matter what's going on around you, you're able to deal with that, right? And ultimately, if you don't have an anchoring, to your point, there's a lot going on, and there's more going on, maybe now, or there's at least more information now than there's ever been, right? Things are faster than they've ever been. If you're not anchored to anything, it's hard to maybe get a footing, right? You're just getting tossed around. You don't know what to think. So, I mean, it is relevant, right? It's always going to be relevant. And I would say, again, in these fast-paced times, it's taking the time to maybe slow down, anchor yourself so you can deal with these things as they come. One thing I think is going to happen to folks, I think is happening to folks in this information-heavy age, because there is so much to consume. If you don't have anything to grasp onto, again, you're just not going to know what to think. It's just too much, right? You don't know where to look. You don't know how to deal with things. So, yeah, Keenan, I would say it's as important as ever, right, to make sure you have a good anchor when the waters are the most turbulent, right?
Absolutely. Amazing, Matt. Well, are there any final thoughts that you would like to leave our listeners with?
No, I think we covered a lot of stuff. It's a big topic, Keenan. I appreciate just being able to do this and, and talk about something that's maybe a little bit different, right, than in the leadership space. So no, I'm just happy to have the opportunity to talk to you and share some ideas and hopefully help some folks.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for being on the Omega Podcast.
Thank you, Keenan. Have a good one.